Okay, so next in chapter 8, they talk a bit about memory retrieval, trying to retrieve information from memory, which of course we have to do. It's not enough to get it encoded in there. We have to be able to retrieve it later on to answer the questions on the test and to retrieve the information, right? So they mentioned a few things there. They mentioned priming. I'm going to let you read about priming. I don't think I've got time to explain everything here in the chapter necessarily, but if you have questions, be sure to let me know. Then they mention the encoding specificity principle. The encoding specificity principle, which is just the idea that something, as you're learning information, something of the context can be encoded with that information into your long-term memory, and that context can later be used as a retrieval cue to help retrieve the information from your long-term memory, right? So encoding specificity principle is kind of the general principle. The specific phenomenon they then talk about in the chapter is context-dependent memory, right? Context-dependent memory. This is referring specifically to some aspect of the environment or the context and how that can be encoded along with the information into memory, and later it can be used as a retrieval cue to get it out. So one goal of what you're doing in memory is you not only want to get the information you want to learn into long-term memory, but what you need to do is connect that information also to other information you know, and that can help serve as retrieval cues to get it out. So they're talking about the importance of retrieval cues, right? And actually finding the information and retrieving it out from your long-term memory when you need to do that. So context-dependent memory, they mentioned the most famous study, or talked about study on context-dependent memory that used scuba divers. So you're talking about environmental context, something of the context being encoded with the information that you're learning. So they had them learn a list of vocabulary words either on land, above water, or underwater, and there's, in scuba gear underwater. So they would learn on land or underwater, and then later you would test them and ask them to recall the words either on land or underwater. All right? So you'd be randomly assigned, in this experiment to one of the 4 conditions, right? Some people would be exposed to the words on land and also be asked to recall the words on land. Others would be, exposed to the words underwater and they'd have to recall the words underwater. And then you have the mismatched groups, right? Where they'd learn the words on land, have to recall them underwater. And then another condition where they'd learn the words underwater and have to recall them on land. Right? Now when you look at that and you see, well, who remembered most of the words? It's people who were in the same context at learning and retrieval, in the same context or the same environment when they learned it and when they had to retrieve it. They remembered more of the words. And so this is the argument that something of the context got encoded with the information into long-term memory. So when they were in that same context, when they had to retrieve the memory, it helped retrieve the memory. So they did better and remembered more of the words if they learned them and tested on them in the same context, right? That's context-dependent memory. And they mentioned another phenomenon in there too, mood congruency. Right, the mood congruent memory, this is a little bit different, right? Mood congruent memory. This is basically where we have a tendency to recall things that match our current mood, the current mood that we are in, right? So if I'm sad, I tend to remember all of the bad things that have happened in my life, right? If I'm happy, I tend to remember all the good things that have happened in my life. So mood congruent memory. When I'm in a particular mood, I tend to remember things that match my mood. So somehow my mood has been encoded with that bad stuff, And when I'm in that mood again, I remember all the bad stuff, right? The mood congruent memory is what that is. And then they mention the serial position effect, which is where you have people remember or learn a list basically of vocabulary words, right? You know, like 1 to 25 vocabulary words. And when you test their recall for that list, you find that they have better recall. They're more likely to remember words at the beginning of the list and words at the end of the list. All right? The name for that overall pattern is the serial position effect. That refers to better memory at the beginning and at better memory at the end of the list. So the words in the middle tend to not be remembered. But there's a specific name when you're talking about memory, improved memory for items at the beginning of a list, all right? That's the primacy effect. So if you're not talking about the whole thing, you're just talking about better memory for items at the beginning of a list, that's the primacy effect is what that's called. Then if you specifically focus on better memory for items at the end of a list, that's called the recency effect, like recent, right? Recency effect, right? So you got to remember all three of those words, right? What refers to improved memory for items at the beginning of a list? Primacy effect, right? What refers to better memory for items at the end of a list? The recency effect. What refers to better memory for items at the beginning and end of a list? Serial position effect. All right, so there's three different things you need to remember there and keep them distinct from each other. Okay?